So I want to start simple, and we're here talking about Indigenous politics and politicians. So I want to start with, how about you tell us how you entered politics really yourself?
Sure. So I was actually asked to join a friend of mine in an election, and was pretty surprised by that ask. You know, I never really saw myself as a politician. I think when we think about a politician, it's really this image that kind of fits into a box of maybe coming from money or showing up in a suit or having a certain type of educational background. And so, yeah, that was something I didn't really see for myself. But when they approached me, they had mentioned, you know, like, I've been seeing you do some really amazing things in the community and helping people build confidence and building community. And I think when they had said those things to me, I was able to connect more to that, to being a community builder and seeing those types of leadership qualities in myself and as something that I possessed and as something that I was using. And so that became a really important piece for me stepping into leadership and just that representation piece. And I wanted to be able to inspire other people just the way that I had been inspired. And so, yeah, I think we don't really need more politicians. We need more people with lived expertise and empathy and people who are going to lift others up around them.
So you've been surrounded by politics for a while now, having you ran for the Yukon NDP federally, right? And then you also worked at the Assembly First Nations. So what made you want to run for the Whitehorse City Council?
Yeah, so my first kind of step into the political world was running in the territorial election. And I still will tell you that's probably the scariest thing I've ever done. But I had an amazing time just being surrounded by people who supported me and wanted to see me succeed. And I actually came runner-up in my riding, losing by only 46 votes.
Wow.
And I think just that experience really, you know, I found a passion and a love for connecting with community in that way. And so when the opportunity came to run for municipal government, which is the closest to our community, I just really jumped into that opportunity to listen and learn and connect with those that I'm sharing this home with again.
So you're the first Indigenous city councillor in Whitehorse in over, I think it's over 30 years, right? And the first Indigenous woman ever. So when I say that, what goes through your mind when you hear that?
Mm-hmm. So when I decided to put my name forward, I actually didn't know that. So somebody had reached out to me and said, you know, I don't think you're the first, but I think it's been a really long time since we've had Indigenous representation on city council. And I was really shocked by that, because I feel like, especially here in the north and in the Yukon, we really understand how important that representation is. And so I did a Google search, and sure enough, the last Indigenous person who served on Whitehorse City Council was actually elected the year that I was born. So, wow. Yeah.
So why is it important then to bring in, you know, Indigenous voices to politics in the Yukon and especially locally?
Yeah, so I think, you know, especially being the first Indigenous woman on Whitehorse City Council, it can be really intimidating and it can feel like a lot of pressure. And I worry a lot of times about maybe not getting it right 100%, but I think just having that voice and that perspective is so important. And I know there's been conversations that we've had that haven't happened before. And I know I've been able to ask questions that nobody else has asked before. And I just think, especially as we're working towards things like truth and reconciliation, and we're talking about traditional knowledge in terms of climate change and incorporating our elders into those conversations, we need to have folks with those Indigenous perspectives and those connections to be there, sharing their voice and showing up and speaking out. So I think it's really important to have those voices around the table.
So, Michelle, what are some of the issues that are maybe a bit unique to Indigenous people in Whitehorse and in that area?
I think, we've been working on some big pieces on this council this year. We're working on some plans that will affect the decisions and the things that we do in our community for the next 20 years. And so looking at things like our declaration of commitment with the First Nations here, the 2 local First Nations, Ta'anquit'an Council and Kwanlin Dun First Nation, and just recommitting to some of those items, working towards Truth and Reconciliation Framework, which is something I'm really excited about and looking forward to in the future. And I think we've seen a really great example of that in Vancouver, with the city of Vancouver, and implementing UNDRIP recently. And so I think those are pieces that I'm really excited to share my voice and bring in those community members and speak with my elders. And some of the other things that have come up this year, we've had some really difficult discussions around women's safety when it comes to our taxi bylaw. We have declared, our territorial government has declared a health emergency. And so we're talking about things like the opioid crisis. We really saw the effects of climate change this year with landslides. And so where I see the connection there is folks who are experiencing homelessness, and these spaces that they've been seeking shelter are no longer safe for them to go. And unfortunately, in all of these situations, Indigenous people are overrepresented.
And I guess getting a little more personal here is what are some of the hardships that maybe an Indigenous politician might face as opposed to a non-Indigenous politician, or what's some of the stuff that you might have faced that some other people might not have, just in running even? Yeah,
so I think something that's important to remember, right, is that these systems that we're working in are colonized structures, and they're systems that aren't built for us, and whether it's recognized or not, they are causing harm and they are creating barriers. And I touched on some of them already, like our bylaws or the way that we approach climate change. And so I think it's hard to navigate those always. And at times it can seem really exhausting. Yeah. I've definitely even had moments where I'm like, oh, why am I even here? Like, it feels like I'm not changing anything, and you can just hit a wall sometimes. But I also need to sit back and kind of ground myself and remember that a lot of these conversations wouldn't even be happening if I wasn't there, or what the conversation would look like if I hadn't been there to share that perspective. So I think it's not only important for somebody like myself who's an elected representative, but I think we need to be working on the inside as well. Like, we need to have that representation and that recruitment and that advancement for Indigenous peoples at all levels within, and just working towards building a better future together for our next generation. So especially now as a mom, I don't want my son to be having some of the same conversations that I'm having to have today, and as well as for all children. I want to build a better future for them, just the way that those who came before us did for me.
Well, Michelle, we're running a little short on time, so I do want to ask you one final question here. Is on the flip side of some of the downside, is you had just touched on it a little earlier, is what can you and other Indigenous politicians bring to the table, at these local, provincial, federal levels that some others just can't?
I think it just really goes back to that perspective. It's a different perspective that we can offer, and we can share our histories and our culture, and those conversations are really important when we're shaping these systems and trying to take down some of those barriers. And I think, just that representation piece for me, again, is so important because I didn't see myself in this role. And I'm so thankful that I had people around me who saw that leadership in me and who supported me to get here. And I really think it's important to tell people when you see that they are making a difference, they're having an impact, that they can and they should be doing this too, because their voices are important and what they have to say is important. And we need to be around the table and be sharing our perspective and our voices, especially when decisions about our futures are being made.
Well, that's certainly well said, Michelle. We are going to have to leave it there as we're a little short on time here, but I want to say thank you, Miigwech, for joining us here and sharing your insight and your knowledge into some of what you go through and you know, some politicians as well. So thank you.
Yeah, Shoni Thun, thanks again.